get a share screen going. So everybody should see the first slide of our Module 5 Dart Incident Command presentation. This fellow in the middle is Jeff West. He's with San Jose Reed Hillview Dart. They had a heck of an exercise about 3 years ago. In fact, Bob Goodwin, who's on this call, is the head of the Reed Hillview Dart. But he was operations director. That was our terminology at the time for what we now call a Dart Incident Commander. His lieutenant, Dave Gooden, in the background is checking in some food that was brought in by this fellow here from the Second Harvest Food Bank. And that's his 18-wheeler in the background there. So Jeff is explaining what's going on to Stephen Tucker, who came down to observe the exercise from Concord. And as a result, Concord now has a Dart up there, courtesy of Stephen and Peg Gardner and DeWitt Hodges. So moving on, requests. Click mute on your Zoom screen unless you need to talk. So hopefully everybody can see where their mute button is, and you might practice muting and unmuting once or twice so you can get it in a flash when you're ready to ask a question. I don't see Ed Story on the call yet. So Gary Vosters, can you have a special
should be here.
I'm right here. I'm right
Ed,
here.
you're
Paul.
there. Okay, Ed is going to be our designated interrupter. So if somebody raises a hand and I don't catch it pretty fast, he's just going to jump in and remind me that somebody needs to have a question answered. So if you need to have a question answered, raise your hand. And there's 3 different emojis that you can choose. Only one of them is raise your hand. The other 2 kind of look like it. One's a clapping hand and the other one's a thumbs up. But if you raise your hand, then I'll get a little hand raise on my screen. And if I don't see it, Ed will see it. We'll get your question answered. Also, if you haven't already done it, please type your name and email address in the chat so we can have a record that you came. And Kwang Wei Wang, do you have a question for me or are you just practicing?
I'm just practicing.
Okay, good enough. Good enough. So you can put down your emojis at that point. And you do have to unraise your hand when you've had your question answered. It won't go down automatically. So areas we'll cover tonight. We're going to look at leadership. How do we become a better leader? What does it mean to be a leader in a Dart environment? Of course, there's a common areas of leadership in life, no matter what you do. We're going to talk about what a Dart Incident Commander does. And we're going to talk about it in a lot of different situations. And we have at least one person on the call tonight, Kwang Wei, who's considering becoming a Dart Incident Commander by Friday. So good luck making that happen.
I guess, does that make me the incident commander for the Santa Monica? Because I'm part of
the
the
Santa
training?
Monica Dart. Yes, it will.
Okay.
And you'll have to have Ed give you a thumbs up, but I just saw him give you a thumbs up. So it looks like you've got his undying support on that one.
Right.
We'll talk about handling possible needs for Dart deviation. That's a sensitive subject. There are other groups that do disaster flights. Not all of them do it the way we do it. So we'll talk about deviations that might need to occur. We'll also talk about operating at different scales, small, very, very small to very, very large. And there's a lot of forms in CalDart. So we'll talk about core forms and some of the other forms. And I do believe I've managed to totally ignore at least 1 or 2 of them that are kind of way off in the boonies that we're not likely to use very often. So first off, on leadership, we'll start with how to lead. This is my attempt at defining it in one simple, easy slide, or maybe 2 of them anyway. Number 1 is that you need to be committed. That covers up so many other flaws. And if you are committed, it's very difficult to be any kind of a good leader. So believe in what you're doing, really want to accomplish what it is that needs to be done in the thing you're choosing to lead, and good things will happen. Number 2 is rise to the challenge. Anytime we look at trying to lead something, usually there's a million things that jump out and look really intimidating. It's like, oh my God, how can I lead? Because I can't do this and I'm not that. And we can talk ourselves out of it pretty fast. But really the thing to do is to say, well, I've got a challenge in front of me. And I need to take that challenge and rise to it. So hopefully you can do that. Next step is make a plan. It doesn't have to be really fancy, but it's just a basic thought of, well, how do we address the problem at hand? And certainly as you go forward, you can modify that plan, but you need to start somewhere. So start off with at least a simple plan. Next up is recruit and train. Pilots and ground staff are the key areas where you need to get people. And in DART, that tends to be a never-ending issue, because usually the people that help us don't have much experience with DART, or they haven't done it in a year or 3 years and they've totally forgotten everything. So training is really a big component. The other part of that is recruiting. By gosh, all of us are salesmen to one extent or another, but if you can't get people to help you, it's very difficult to do much with your DART. So you don't necessarily have to have a lot of people on your first DART adventure, but as you grow with time, hopefully you can spend some time recruiting. Next up is active communication. So that's communicating to people, but it's also listening very carefully, because people have a desire to, hang on just a second, I want to check my waiting room and make sure that I've got everybody in. And I do. Okay, so we'll close that. So communicating is not only speaking, but it's listening. And it's listening and really thinking about what people have to say, because oftentimes it's easy to miss the underlying point of what people have to say, or they may be trying to be really polite, or for some reason they can't be very direct. So a lot of times it's a trick to truly figure out what someone's trying to tell you. Next up is lean on your strengths and bolster your weaknesses. So all of us have something we can do well, and all of us have things we can't do well. So a good way to bolster your weaknesses is to get somebody in to help you. So for instance, one of the people who's really gotten a lot done in DART over the years is Ron Lovick out of San Diego. Ron isn't very good at all with logistics and administrative stuff, spreadsheets and that sort of thing. He has a real hard time organizing things, but boy, does he love to get involved and get things done. And he has ambition, and he has a lifelong history in response through police and other emergency services, Red Cross. And he's been close to so much that Caldar has gotten done. So I use that as one example of a person who's not perfect, but who can get so much done with commitment and enthusiasm. Next up, this isn't as important to some people as it is to us, especially for DART incident commanders. We got to be sure we don't run all over people, and that we understand where they're coming from, and that we strive to make them enjoy the experience. And sometimes organizing a DART exercise can be very stressful, because there can be so much going on at the same time. So try to anticipate that ahead of time, and try to keep everybody in a level where they're having a good time. And by the way, if you do have a question, put that hand up. Raise your hand, as I believe is the technical term. And if I don't see it, Ed will remind me. Next up is preparing yourself to lead. So, all of us start from a certain place with our skill set, and all of us can get better. So one thing is to prepare. It's helpful. Like if you've read the DARP, if you've done all these different things that you can to prepare yourself, you'll be a much more effective DART leader. If possible, start small and grow with experience. To the extent we work on incremental improvement, we can always keep things in control, and we can never get too stressed. And every once in a while, we take a really big step and we can't handle it. And that can be very stressful and very demotivating. So we want to avoid that. So if this is your first exercise or your second exercise, try to make each one a little better than the last one, so you can learn something and gradually build your skill set. So another way to prepare is to participate. Different DARTs are each supposed to have one exercise a year. Most people are open to letting you come and observe their exercise, or maybe they're a little bit short on staff and they'd love to have somebody that can help out in one of their management positions, you could help them staff that position. And so to do that, of course, if you intend to be a DART leader, start a DART at your airport, and we will get you on the DART leadership group, which has a monthly Zoom call. And that's where all the DART leaders share information about what's going on at their airports. And it's where we build our network that we can call upon when we have a disaster. Now, I talked about observing our own stuff, but we can also learn a lot by reaching outside DART, CalDART, and looking at other organizations. So EAA, with their Oshkosh show every year, and for that matter, any large air show, is a wonderful laboratory for you to go study and see how they're managing their crowd control, how they organize things. Public benefit flying organizations. I belong to League of the Flying Doctors of Mercy. Some people do Angel Flight West. They have certain ways of operating that are common to a lot of public benefit organizations. We try to emulate those things, and to the extent you learn them, it'll help you be a better DART leader, DART incident commander. Young Eagles, boy, DART is like Young Eagles on steroids. So if you want to be a Young Eagle pilot, we have ramps that need to be safe at a Young Eagle rally, just like we have ramps that need to be safe at a DART. We have pilots that have to sign forms, need to get a safety briefing, just like we do in DART. So Young Eagles is really a good place to get some experience. Helping on the ground in a Young Eagles organization, getting all the kids registered, getting them lined up, and getting them matched with pilots. That's what customer service and flight ops is all about. So it's a good learning environment for that. And of course, the DART. We have a disaster airlift response plan. It's 80 pages long. It's a little bit dense. Read it, and then go back a month later and read it again, and go back and study all the forms that go along with it, and read it before you have your next exercise. And it's a good way to get your mind wrapped around everything we need to do in a DART to operate best. So what else can you do to prepare yourself to lead? So on the CalDART website, we have a document called Utilizing GA in Catastrophic Disasters, which compromise surface transportation. It has a lot of interesting information about California and its airports and its pilots, about how to maximize throughput in airports, and gets you thinking big about what you can do in a disaster response if you need to do something in a real disaster on large scale. FEMA has some courses which help out: the Incident Command System and the National Incident Management System, as well as points of distribution. So those are all taught in IS 26, IS 100, 200, and 700. Those are well worth your time. Next up, be an experienced pilot or have one on your management team, because a lot of what we do involves judgment decisions about whether to make flights and who to send. And if you have an experienced pilot that thinks along those lines, that will make your operation be a higher quality operation. And I've mentioned this before, but just try to improve each year. So you can start small, start modest, but grow and gain skill over time. So what do we do when disaster strikes? So you've got a little DART, you've got a core team, you attempt to talk to each other and say, wow, maybe this is something we should consult with our community about. Well, who's in position to respond? Who's our best person to be a DART incident commander? You work all that out. One person gets the job, and then they go out to your partners. So your partners might be people like the local county VOAD, the volunteer organizations active in disaster. And if your particular county doesn't have one, there may be one for your region. CalDART itself belongs to NorCal VOAD and SoCal VOAD, and a lot of our work that we've done has been in conjunction with people in those groups. So the VOADs are a good place to start. In Santa Clara County, my home county, I belong to the VOAD, our DART belongs to the VOAD, our other two DARTs belong to it as well. We have something like 30 or 40 organizations that all belong to Santa Clara County VOAD. its technical name is CADRE, Collaborating Agencies Disaster Response Effort. But they have needs. They may need transportation, and you can serve them. Dave, go ahead.
Just real quick, a DART core team, is that part of one DART unit or several members of different DART units?
Okay, so at your DART, you may start off as a core team of one. As you grow, you'll probably get more people involved over time. Some of those people are just tangentially involved and willing to show up once a year at an exercise. Other people may be willing to do some work and meet in between times. So as people willing to do some work and meet in between times, that's your core team.
Thanks.
And you got Diane too.
Yeah, Diane, go ahead. And Diane, you'll need to unmute.
There we go. Paul, I got a couple of questions. When a disaster happens, how are we communicate? What's the communication process? If the internet goes down or the phones go down or whatever, how do you get a hold of us to come and help?
Well, there you go. So texting works best if the telecommunications network is having trouble and it still is at least partly operable. At my DART, we try to have our core team invest in Motorola FRS GMRS 35-mile walkie-talkies. Of course, they don't go 35 miles, but we have got them to go about 7 or 8 miles line of sight without any obstructions. And that would be a way that you could start calling each other from home. If you can't get together, you might consider just going to the airport. If you've invested some time and effort in your DART, you may have an amateur radio at the airport. You may be able to call your local emergency operations center in the towns that are immediately adjacent to the airport and ask them if they need service. And of course, if you work with them on your annual exercise and you have frequencies located in the in your DART hangar of what are the frequencies that we use, that can work as well. If you're really an ambitious DART, you might have everybody in the core management team get their own amateur radios and get a license with the FAA to use those radios. And one other thing, if you've got some money, a satellite phone is a good idea. That's a completely independent way of communicating and might be working when others aren't. Thank you, Diane.
Well, I have both landline on Comcast and Verizon for cell phone. Hopefully they both won't go down at the same time. And do we ever use handheld aircraft frequency radios to communicate?
We can. We're not licensed to use them for anything but published frequencies. That said, there are often frequencies you can use that are not in use in any commercial application, not for any tower within 200 miles. For instance, you'll often hear airline pilots talking on 5 fingers, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because they happen to know that that's not an assigned frequency and people use it. There are air-to-air frequencies, which of course would be the place to start.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Paul, I understand you have some pigeons in the backyard too, don't you?
No, I don't. Good thought. I like that. Okay, so we're deciding if a DART mobilization is needed. If we mobilize, we inform the airport administration that we're going to mobilize. We advise our partners that we will be mobilized so they can start planning on having our services ready and they can send us service requests. We can recruit a ground team and pilots. So recruiting early is a big part of a successful mobilization because you got to get people out there. Recruiting, of course, starts with your own airport. If you can't get enough people, ground team and pilots from your own airport, go to the CalDART network. We have 300 and some people registered with us. Hopefully that'll continue to grow. A lot of times when you're at the core of the disaster, that DART is going to be responsible for responding, but their individual members, a whole lot of them may be personally impacted and unable to respond. So it may be that the local DART sends out a plea for help. Like, can you guys put together a DART, send it out to our airport and help us? Because boy, do we need help responding to this thing. Mary, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just curious. Listening to this and reading this, so it's the local DART that's actually going to make a decision about mobilizing. It was my understanding that the DART was mobilized once requests came in, but this seems like we're proactively reaching out. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's subtly different ways to think about it. So your person that runs your DART, Scott Beasley, he comes from a county environment, and there's a top-down chain of command in the National Incident Management System, and the county is the lead dog. So it's possible to organize your DART as a subsidiary of the county that gets activated by the county. That's not the model we've generally chosen in CalDART, because most counties don't know much about aviation operations, and they're a little bit reluctant to be responsible for an aviation operation. We have chosen the public benefit flying organization model, where public benefit flying organizations manage their own business. They market to their customers, and they market, they recruit pilots, and they provide their service. So usually what we do is we inform our emergency partners in the volunteer organizations active in disaster, in the cities and counties. Hey, we're a DART in your area. This is what we do. If there's a bad disaster, we're going to call you and get your inputs on how bad you think it is. And if we mobilize, we'll let you know and let you know that service is available. And we're perfectly within our rights as a volunteer organization operating under Part 91 to do that. We have relationships with the California Air Coordination Group, which exists at the State Operations Center when California responds to a disaster. And that's where we send our Form California 220As to every year when we do our exercises, so that they will have situational awareness that we're operating, and they can include us in the overall emergency airspace operation plan. Diane, go ahead, Mary.
Yeah, just can you repeat that? Who do the 220As go to?
Okay, the 220As go to CalDART, events@caldart.org. It's in your event registration paper form. And they also go to the California Air Coordination Group. And on the current Form 220A, California Form 220A, and don't use the old one because they changed their email address. Their current email address is a address that goes to some California government email address. The old one went to a Gmail address. But you fill out that Form 220, you send it to us, you send it to them, and now they know you're operating. Bob Goodwin, did you want to add to that?
Yes, copy also goes to your airport manager. And if it's an actual emergency, copy also goes to your county EOC. So 4 copies of that form if it's a real
and your city EOCs would be appropriate as well. We should probably update our paperwork on that, Bob. Diane, do you still have a question?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
When I was in the Civil Air Patrol, we had our own set of radios and specific radio frequencies, not ham exactly. I'm not exactly sure what channel it was, that we could communicate with other CA squadrons. And I'm wondering if DART has anything like that. Is there like a state level DART that has frequencies that coordinates each DART unit by radio or anything like that?
No, the closest we come to that is that we have each of our DARTs is tasked with putting together an amateur radio capability. And we will have statewide nets where our amateur radio operators talk to each other, and our goal is to keep each airport in the CalDART net able to communicate to each other via our state backbone network. Now I say our network, but it's not really our network. It's a shared network. It's the CARLA system, and it's liable to be heavily used during a disaster. It might be very hard to use it. We are not a governmental entity, so we don't have our own frequency spectrum allocated to CalDART. Probably never will get to that point.
Let me comment about frequencies. I speculate that the CAP, Civil Air Patrol, probably is using some frequencies that none of us can use. They're government frequencies because the federal government and state governments have their own frequencies not controlled by the FCC. All frequencies are controlled by either of two federal organizations, the FCC and I forget the name of the other organization that handles the government itself, the government frequencies.
Thank you, Wayne. And by the way, everybody, when you want to speak, go ahead and make sure you press the raise hand button so we can get everybody queued up and keep it going. Thank you for that. Wayne Roten, by the way, is the Amateur Radio Emergency Services staff person at Scapadart. And Scapadart's having an exercise this Saturday, and he's been very helpful in getting us set up to talk to our emergency operations centers in Morgan Hill and Gilroy. So thank you for your help on that, Wayne. Okay, so we talked about recruiting. Now an org chart. There's 4 sample org charts in the DARP, but really there's no special magic to an org chart. You create your org chart according to who you get to show up. And sometimes a person comes and they have a special capability, so they get a particular title. We've already talked about advising CalDART and the California Air Coordination Group, and then requesting assistance if needed. So that's through the CalDART network, and I'll show some more escalation paths in the future slide. Okay, so now let's look at an org chart. Positions on an org chart should be filled depending on volunteer qualifications, capabilities, and the quantity of volunteers that you have. It also should be dependent on the importance of the function to be filled. So, make sure your most important functions get filled first. Each mobilization may have slightly different needs, and that may impact your organization chart. Maybe something that would normally be needed isn't really needed in this particular mobilization. And now I've done a couple of org charts, taken the charts out of the DARP, and shown you some default ways you might populate your org chart, all things equal. So here's levels 4 and 3, using the level 3 org chart that you'd find out of the DART. We have a DART incident commander. That's the very first position you have to fill. Position number 2 is some pilots, because you're not going to fly if you don't have pilots. And if that's all you do, this is a level 4 DART mobilization. You have an incident commander and somebody who flies. If you're really, really modest, it might be that it's the same person who's the incident commander and who's flying. And that may be Kwang Wei Wong's exercise this weekend. Maybe he can con Ed Story into being his DART incident commander while he does the flying. You never know. Next up, a flight operations manager. If you want to get some more pilots, it's helpful if you can spin off all that to somebody who can worry about recruiting them and getting their information. Pilot intake is very labor intensive. And so that's an important position to fill. Now, notice on this particular chart, I happen to call everybody a manager. We should be so lucky that the third person that we get to help us happens to be of managerial quality. That implies that they've got some experience with the DARP, that they're able to effectively execute all of the functions in there, and that they don't need a whole lot of training. So it may be that this is more of a flight operations staff person, at least to start out with, until they really learn the job and can become a proper manager. Next up, you might try customer service at 4, because if you've got a lot of customers that need to be helped, if you're serving the general population, you might need to interface a whole lot of people pretty quickly. If the general population starts coming to your airport, you might need to have a ramp manager, somebody to keep the ramp safe. So if you're allowing people on the ramp, we had a whole class on that last night about how to keep the ramp safe. And finally, recruitment manager. In a really small organization, my experience is that the DART incident commander ends up being the recruiter. And it's pretty rare that you can get a person who can do a good job of this, who's willing to do this. So that might be the last position staffed in the smaller organizations. So it's an important job, especially it's important as you recruitment management, that is, as you get into the bigger org charts, but it's a smaller one, not as important, and it is hard to fill. Okay, next up, let's get a little more ambitious. So now we have a level 2 DART mobilization. Now, what's the order of staffing this one? Now, it's not surprising, but it's pretty similar to the order, the first one. So just like the incident command system says, the first person on the scene owns the responsibility for it, and you gradually grow the operation. So it could be that your operation is growing from a level 4 to a level 3, and now it's getting to a level 2. So I started off with my DART incident commander. I had pilot, flight operations, and staff as a number 2. Number 3 was customer service staff because I needed to deal with the community. Number 4 was ramp. So this part of it's pretty much identical. And we get to number 5, the recruitment manager. And now, boom, I start getting some other things. As I start adding more pilots and more flight ops staff, it really is important to have a flight operations manager, because in flight operations is where you can make some of your worst decisions. So get your best skill there. Ramp, that's really important because public safety on the ramp is easy to compromise. So make sure you're staffed with a qualified person out on the ramp. And next up, safety officer, because the bigger your operation gets, the more all the people that are managers might get a little task saturated, and the more they might start missing real safety issues that are going on that need to be addressed. And the classic role of a safety officer is they coach people that aren't doing it right, but if for some reason it doesn't get responded real quickly, this person's not allowed to get task saturated. They just basically have to shut the operation down. We stop everything till we get the problem fixed, and then we start the operation again. So after safety officer, now we're getting to number 9, customer service manager, and number 10, recruitment staff to help out the recruitment manager. Seeing no questions, I'll move to a level 1 staffing order. Now, level 1, if you really know you're going to need to be big right out the chute, your priorities change a little bit. You're going to want to get your planning section chief going first and get a real high quality person. This is the person who starts out as your recruitment manager. You want them to be able to recruit. You want them to be able to get a person who can recruit, and you want them to be able to do some documentation, because you're not going to grow an operation to 50 or 100 people unless you do a whole lot of outreach. And this person here just doesn't have time to do that kind of outreach. So you want to get your planning section chief established. Now you move over to your operations section chief. This should be a high quality person as well. So in our CalDART organization, for this quality of people, we might be escalating to our DARTs around the state saying, can you give me 1 or 2 really good people that can help me here or help me here? They need to be able to recruit. They need to be able to handle problems and complexities that arise at the flight operations and the ramp operations and the customer service level. They need to have good DART capability. You know, the buck has to stop here so that the DART incident commander doesn't become a weak link in slowing down the whole operation, because the DART incident commander has to deal with these things. So by the same token, if it's a big operation, you're going to have to think of things like, how do I feed people? How do I get electricity? How do we put computers in here? How do I get a coffee pot and a microwave oven and a refrigerator? How am I going to get my radio communications going? Is the telephone network really out? How else am I going to communicate? So there's some big time issues to worry about in logistics. You want to get a logistics chief going. So then we start recruiting and getting some of our management level people. Notice that the recruitment manager came before flight ops and ramp ops and customer service, because quality recruitment is really going to be key to having an effective operation. You got to have people that can do these different jobs. Finance and admin, keep in mind that this is a chart that comes out of ICS, and incident command system grows easily about 10 to 50 times bigger than we do. And they're government organizations that have budgets and funding. We don't typically have funding. So our finance issues tend to be pretty small. We don't bill anybody. We don't reimburse anybody. We might do a little bit of that at the DART level, but it's compared to what the public organizations do, it's pretty darn small. So that's why it's staffed so late. Typically, your finance issues are being handled directly by the incident commander prior to that position being filled. And so that's what I would offer on level 1 staffing order. And Wayne, go ahead. Wayne, you need to unmute.
Now, what's the meaning of the X on the radio and satellite communications?
Thank you. If you got a disaster where the telephone network works, then you can call everybody up that you need to, and that's probably your preferred means of communication. If you've got a disaster where the telecom networks have gone down, now nobody has communications, and your communications group earns its spurs. And all of a sudden, they need a really organized operation. They need to be able to write down all their messages so that no message gets lost. They need to keep a log of the messages. They need to have runners so that they can run messages from the communications desk to the incident commander to the flight operations desk, because there's a whole lot of communications that are going on, and all of that gets pushed right through the radio and satellite communications. So the X there is because it could be anywhere from a very important and key thing to staff right away, or it could be that it's just not needed in this operation. Okay, so Diane, go ahead.
Paul, what determines the level that you have to have for a disaster? Is it the scale of the disaster or the number of people who live in the area that you have to serve? And how do we know whether we're going to have a level 1 or a level 4, for instance?
Okay, so let's go back. Well, I'll answer it. And I think there's another slide that deals with that question, but if not, we'll answer it right here. So you can grow as big as you are capable of growing. And it could be that if you need to grow bigger than that, maybe you ask for help to try to bring in more experienced people that can help you grow your organization to a larger level. Ideally, you're as big as you need to be to serve the entire community. And if it's a really big disaster, you're utilizing 100% of that runway and ramp space that's available at the airport and doing hundreds of operations a day, maybe even 1,000 a day. So, so that's what influences how big it gets. So you choose the organization chart based on how big an operation you're putting together. Okay.
Hey, Paul, Ed here. Just a couple of quick comments. One was a question. I don't see anywhere in here the term telephone tree. Have you considered a telephone tree for some of these organizations as they get larger?
Yeah, telephone trees are great, and they're a classic way of getting a hold of people, and they're especially good when some people aren't good at reading emails and text messages. It's funny. If you deal with a universe of volunteers, whether they be pilots or ground volunteers, everybody has a different way that they're effective at being communicated with. Some people will only get back to you if you call them. Some people are better at email. So I'm a little bit remiss here to not mention phone trees. Thank you for mentioning that, Ed. Colette, go ahead.
Yeah, Paul, you know, in the real live exercise, in the real live missions that we've flown, what level have we gotten to organizationally? Have we ever gotten to the level 1 or even level 2?
We had a level 1 ground crew deployment many years ago at San Martin. But it didn't handle level 1 air traffic. It was basically just an exercise in putting all those different things together, the logistics and everything else. The biggest real mobilization we've had is the 23 planes we did on a single day for Santa Barbara. That particular operation didn't even have customer service because there was only one customer. And it didn't have a local DART because there was not a DART team at the Santa Barbara airport. We had 3 DART members there, CalDART members, who were helpful, and that was a big help. So they helped us staff a material desk. They helped us staff basically a flight operations department. We had the local amateur radio group that pulled a ton of its people out to the airport and filled the ramp staff positions and loaded all the planes. And basically I was the incident commander that day with not a single trained manager to assist, and with the pilots filling out their own aircraft load sheets and turning them back into 1 or 2 people that were operating a flight operations desk as flight operations staff. Okay, moving on. So here's a slide that looks at 2 basic things. And this gets to Mary's question earlier about, do we self-activate or do we wait for the county to activate us? We're taking the independent business unit model approach. We're a business unit. We market our services to the city and county's emergency services group, to community organizations active in disaster. That could be CERT, that could be the Red Cross, Cadre in my particular county, VOAD, food banks, ARES, all the different faith-based organizations, people that are out there. We want to develop expertise in dealing with fragile people. There's a lot of people that cannot survive in a disaster zone, even though they might be fairly healthy people otherwise. So if you have a senior residential living community, there may be a lot of hired staff there that can't come. There may be a need for power and electricity and cooks that they don't have. So they may have to evacuate their senior community and get them out of there. If you have people on dialysis, dialysis is particularly deadly. You're dead in about 7 days if you don't get your dialysis, and you can only have dialysis if you have clean municipal water, lots of clean dialysis supplies, and a well-functioning electricity system, and a dialysis center that you can go into with technicians that show up to work that have a working facility. So basically, you're looking at getting your dialysis people out of there in a hurry. And the same can be true for a variety of other medical conditions. So try to develop sensitivity as to who those fragile people are and develop connections with the people that care for those fragile people so they can call on you to get them out of the area. Businesses. So businesses may need help and residents may need help. These are the areas we market to. We market through social networks like Facebook and Nextdoor. We market through ads in the newspaper. We market through spots on radio. We ask our emergency assistance centers who are putting out public messaging that goes to everybody's cell phones and such, tell them that the DART is operating, tell them that service is available, tell them this is the phone number they contact, or tell them to show up at the airport, whatever your particular messaging is. So that's how we market outward. Now, how do we request assistance? So each DART around the state is responsible for managing their local area. If they can't do it on their own, they go to CalDART and ask for help. And that's our CalDART network of 305 or so registered people. That can bring in pilots, it can bring in ground volunteers. You can network with the people you know in the DART leadership teams, all the DART leaders around the state. They may have some high-skilled people that can come in and help you. Next step, Ed, go ahead.
I was just going to say that by way of example, some years ago, I was on the board of the local Santa Monica Red Cross. And we got, as you perhaps recall, because I know you came down to a couple of our exercises, we got them to bring a truck in. They brought in about 3 or 4 different workers for essentially the exercise. And so it worked out very well. I think the Red Cross is a great operation. And And Quang Wei, I'll be happy to introduce you to the folks over there so that you'll be in touch with them.
Okay, thanks, Ed. Next up, we can go to the Air Care Alliance. So for instance, Angel Flight West is providing 5 pilots to the Scapa DART exercise this weekend. They provided 7 pilots to the Santa Barbara, Oregon firefighter operation. We have a written MOU with them that's copied and distributed to each of the DART leaders around the state. You can call on that MOU and follow its operations. In fact, we'll go over that MOU in a bit. Besides Angel Flight West, there's the Air Care Alliance. Inside the Air Care Alliance, there's EVAC, the Emergency Volunteer Air Corps. They're like the emergency wing of the Air Care Alliance, if you would. There's the WEGARP, which is the West Coast General Aviation Response Plan, which is a loose affiliation of people headed by a guy in the Seattle area. And they have connections in British Columbia, Oregon, Washington. So those are our ways that we can request mutual aid. Next, when you arrive at the airport, if needed, help bring the airport into service. You know, that airport may have suffered from the disaster, and job number 1 may just be to make it so that planes can use the airport. So if you have members that have heavy equipment businesses, maybe they're needed to help smooth out a taxiway, who knows? Next up, wear your uniform and ask others to wear a uniform. That's the dark black or blue pants, white shirt, dark vest, or general safety vest. Set up and sign a CalDART volunteer waiver of liability. Set up and sign in on the personnel duty roster. Now note that you as the DART incident commander, you're in charge of getting all this stuff out, not only for yourself, but for everybody who's going to follow you into the operation. Train staff before beginning operations. That's an important concept. We don't just go and give people service. We make sure that everybody that's doing their job knows how to do the job correctly so that as we perform our operations, we'll have a safe operation. Next, cordon off the public area if you're going to have one on the ramp before beginning operations. And here's the last thought. You are in charge of the operation. You know, this isn't, certainly you want to listen and take good ideas from people, but the buck stops with you. You're in charge of making the decisions. So core forms, we have a lot of forms in DART. What are some of the core ones you're going to use? Volunteer recruitment is an important task. That's the CalDART pilot certification and waiver of liability. Ed, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say on the last slide, you may recall at least one of the exercises we had some years ago at Santa Monica, we had a young lady who was one of the air traffic controllers and who was very enthusiastic about this. And she got involved very heavily in it. So it made a marvelous connection to the control tower.
Thank you. Okay, so core forms and volunteer recruitment. You've got your CalDART pilot certification and waiver of liability, CalDART volunteer waiver of liability, and a personnel duty roster. So if you have a recruitment manager, this is typically the stuff they're managing. In customer service, it's the CalDART passenger waiver of liability. Anybody who flies has to sign one. It's a cargo identification label. It's important to weigh and track each box of cargo that you're going to be shipping. It's kind of a nicety, but if you have a passenger ticket, you can use it. You can use the service request form if you have a lot of information that you have to track for each customer, in which case you'd be using a service request log to go with it. You can also use it, instead of that, the shipping receiving log, which is a very simple way of keeping track of what you're going to send in the planes. For flight operations, aircraft load sheets, you want an aircraft load sheet for every plane that departs. You want an airlift dispatch log where you're tracking all the flights that you've set up. You'll want a pilot's list of all the pilots that have gone through your pilot intake process and are authorized to fly in the operation. And those pilots will fill out a pilot and aircraft information form that gives you all the basic information you need to know about that pilot and his aircraft. And there are a couple of forms that the DART incident commander has to do, the CalDART event registration form and the Form California 220. So we'll start off with those last two forms because this is a DART incident commander presentation. So if you've got a real disaster, send in the event registration form and the Form California 220 as soon as possible after going operational. You know, it's probably not something you're going to be able to do right off the bat. But when you send them in, you can start mobilizing resources to help you. And if it's a real big disaster, that's a good thing. The CA-220 may not be needed for disaster where airspace has no unusual aspects. So for instance, COVID was a national disaster. We were active in COVID. We never once filed a CA-220 for COVID because you know, the airspace coordination group was not active at any time, so there was no need to. On an annual exercise, so now this is flipping. This is the different application. When you've got an annual exercise, send in your event registration form approximately 1 month prior to the CalDART people. That's events@caldart.org. And then when you get to the 220, send it into CalDART about a week prior so that we can get a look at it for you. A lot of people have trouble if they haven't filled out one of those forms in a long time. And then send it to the California Air Coordination Group the day before your exercise. That's for an annual exercise. Okay, so let's look at some of these forms. On the CalDART event registration form, this starts out with some instructions. Then you type in below the name of the DART, the date of the event, the primary airports at which you will operate, and the approximate number of flights you expect to launch as a part of the exercise. The next thing you type in, or handwrite, the responsible person, and that's going to be typically the DART incident commander is the responsible person that's filling out this form. Submits this form and must be a CalDART member. So here's the first of several CalDART membership requirements. Fill in your name and email address and the date you're submitting the application as the person responsible for the event below. The responsible person is referred to as you herein. So this is where you put your name, Joe Blow, I'm the responsible person. And then fill in the names of the people, if any, who will assist you in managing the event. So event managers must be CalDART members. Now, here's where you can slide a little bit. It could be that your people are just staff people, in which case they don't need to be CalDART members because they're just staff. But if these are core people that are helping you run the DART long-term, they really should be CalDART members. Next step. Confirm by typing yes below that you will require all pilots acting as pilot in command on a flight in this event. A, be CalDART members. B, show evidence of minimum aircraft liability insurance of $1 million for the liability and $100K per seat. C, show required medical documentation, which could be basic med or a valid type 1, 2, or 3 medical certificate. D, sign the standard pilot CalDART pilot certification and waiver of liability. So basically pilots are agreeing not to sue people and agree to fly a conforming Part 91 flight. And then they have to present their pilot certificate to you for inspection, as well as a government issued photo ID, and describe any variances on these items. So Diane, go ahead.
Well, do we have to do that every time there's an event, or can we get all these things together and file them with the DART so they're all ready to go? You don't have to go through all that every time?
The event registration form needs to be filed with every event. Pilot intake, if a pilot intake has gone through a pilot intake at a recognized DART within the last year, that intake is good and does not need to be repeated.
Okay.
Okay, next, type below which approved DART you will use for the exercise. So the CalDART version, it says 2.0 here, but 2.1 is actually the current one, is required, except the following DART operators may use their own. So back in the day, DART operators had to write their own darts. It was a terrific pain in the rear. And so we did end up with darts that can use their own darts because they wrote their own. They're very similar to the CalDart one, and it's recommended that they eventually migrate to the CalDart dart. Diane, go ahead.
Sorry, I forgot to take the hand down.
Okay, good enough. Then let's see. Next up, confirm by typing yes below that you will have all exercise participants either sign a volunteer waiver, a pilot certification and waiver, or a passenger waiver as appropriate to their activities on the waiver as explained on the waiver instructions. So waivers are a big thing in these exercises. Make sure people sign them. Further, that you will keep all exercise records and waivers for at least 3 years and will provide them to CalDart upon request. Next up, confirm by typing yes below that a DART exercise is the only event you are organizing on this date, and that no non-DART activities, air show, airport open house, Young Eagles, or similar, will be associated in any way with the DART exercise on this date. And describe any variances. It could be that it would make sense to do a DART in conjunction with something else. Approval is a slam dunk if there is no other event, but we certainly want to hear about it if there is, and we need to go over that together. And then at the end, give any further explanations as would be appropriate. So there's a box for that. And then at the very end, by typing my name here, I certify that the information in this form is accurate and gives a full picture of all pertinent facts and circumstances affecting this event of which I am aware. I will resubmit this form if there is a material change in any aspect of the event which would affect my certification here. Okay, so things that wouldn't really affect it is if you have 1 or 2 more pilots showing up, that wouldn't be an issue. Something that would affect it is if you suddenly decide that you're not going to require anybody to sign waivers, just to give you an idea of what's not material versus what is material. Okay, and here's the form California 220A. So it starts off with an incident name. You can name it your DART, particular DART, like Half Moon Bay DART annual exercise, the operational period, the from to the to, which is typically some hours of the day, just a single day. The agency name is going to be CalDart. It might just be Half Moon Bay DART that's supplying planes. In Saturday's exercise, it's actually 3 agencies. CalDart, Scapa DART, and Angel Flight West are all providing aircraft. So you put the aircraft type, such as a PA-28, a tail number. You put a mission number, which typically is our type. We don't typically have mission numbers pre-assigned, but we do have mission types, which is cargo and passenger transport. Frequencies, generally, we're going to say as published, because we're just using public frequencies. And all aircraft listed here are typically going to be active and available. Active actually is like they're being used. So available is available but not being used, and unavailable means broke down. So we're not going to typically list aircraft that are available or unavailable. We're just going to list the active aircraft. So prepared by your name, position, and title with your email and phone number. And this is important because the California Air Coordination Group, if there's a real disaster, may need to go back to you and talk to you. And if this is just an annual exercise, it's still important for them because it helps them keep track of how big CalDart is, which of our darts are active, and it keeps the skids greased so that they know that we're out there and we're operating. Now, submit the form. This is the current version of the form, California Air Coordination Group at departmentoftransportation.california.gov. And that used to be a Gmail address. And also you mail it to events@caldart.org. So this is how Bob Goodwin and I get a copy of it. And then this one doesn't really apply to us because we're not in this particular community. Okay, so now someone asked earlier, how big does it get? So I think this is the slide where we talk about how big does it get. So you want to achieve the largest scale on your DART operation. On the one hand, it's got to be safe and needed by the impacted parties. Well, that's actually 2 things. That's all that matters with it right here is it's got to be safe and it's got to be needed by the impacted parties. Now, to keep it safe, it may need to operate at a scale that you can't operate. So that's when you ask for help and try to scale it up. And these are your escalation paths. So if an operation is large, you can create an incident action plan consisting of a documentation plan. So this is a form peculiar to CalDART. In the last year or two, we got so many forms that it started to be confusing how many forms we had. So this is like a guide to all the different forms that are available, and it says who uses them. The next one is the Incident Command System Form 201, Incident Briefing, and Incident Objectives. These are handy if you're doing shift work between different DART incident commanders taking 8-hour shifts, or from one commander to another on a day shift, change of day. That's what you do for a large operation. Here's the documentation plan. It shows all the different documents that are available and who uses them. And you just put a check here if you're going to use them in your organization. So if you've got a 50-person ground crew, they're going to need some guidance on, well, what are we doing and what are we not doing? So you just put a check mark on the ones that they're going to be using, and it's up to them to go use them. And like I said, we've got a lot of documents. So here's the incident briefing. This is another feature of a large incident. You start off with your incident name. It might have a number and a date and time initiated, and then a map sketch. This is kind of helpful to show your layout of your DART operation at the airport if you are operating at the airport. Because if they need to send 20 firefighting aircraft down to the operation and you've taken up a part of the ramp, they can see how much of the ramp you're using. The next, situation summary and health briefing, safety briefing. This is good for changeover of command to tell people what's going on and what they need to do. So you say who it's prepared by. Here's another good one. What are our current and planned objectives? You might say, well, like Second Harvest Food Bank has a really urgent need and we're putting all of our resources to that. Whatever the strategic thoughts are that way, you pass that to the person coming in. And this is also published if you have a big group and somebody's working in customer service, they can look at this and say, oh, you're a high priority customer. Yes, I'll certainly help you. Or they can say, well, we're kind of full up because we're trying to do this other thing. This is a way of communicating those strategies out into the organization because everybody can get a copy of this incident briefing. And if you have any special actions that are going to occur at specific times that you want to brief people about, you can put them in right here. And next up, there's an org chart. So a lot of our mobilizations, we're going to fill out the bottom of this org chart where we can freeform stuff. We may not have all the very high level operations because we rarely get that big. But nonetheless, there's an org chart in this standard form. Next up, there's a resource summary. I would just refer to the pilots list because that's the way that we track resources that we've got. And our flight operations group is going to be very actively tracking and recruiting their resources. So here's the Form 202, Incident Objectives. You can say what you're trying to get done for a specific incident. You can also check all of the different forms that comprise together a part of the Incident Action Plan. If your radio group is active, for instance, you're going to need an ICS Form 205. This is where the amateur radio operators go. Next up, we're going to commence operations when our ground team is trained and ready. If there will be a public area on the ramp that we've cordoned off that public area from the rest of the ramp, and we have some safety monitors, some ramp personnel to make sure it's safe. And when our DART functions that we're implementing, if that's customer service, flight operations, whatever, they're operational so that operations can be safely conducted. That's when we commence operations. So there's a preparation period for getting the DART going. And when that preparation and establishment period is complete, now we go operational. So once we're operational, what do? We tell the public we're operational. This is where the County public information operator may be able to help to get our spots on priority placement on public radio. We explain how to contact the DART. And we're utilizing all these different networks that can help us get our message out to the world. Now, this assumes that we want really broad communication of our capability. If you're operating in the Los Angeles basin with 10 million people and 12 airports, it may be that you can't serve everybody. So it may be that you target a narrower group of people for starters, and you don't go with a full public announcement. That needs to be played out as makes sense for the particular community you're serving and the scale of the disaster and the amount of resources that you have available to serve that disaster. And you operate the DART per the DART. So that's our disaster airlift response plan. Now I'll get into a spot later on deviations from the DART, because particularly in actual mobilizations, it can be very challenging to follow the DART to the letter of the law. But our basic concept here is that we review passengers, we serve our customers, and in particular be sensitive to medical issues. So we've got a section 2.05 for medical considerations for both cargo and passengers that you might not have in your ordinary flying experience. But we're going to dispatch pilots as a part of serving our customers, give them aircraft, give them things to fly and airports to fly to. We're going to maintain a safe ramp so that people aren't getting hurt. And as needed, we're going to perform additional recruiting and request mutual aid. So that would be scaling up the exercise if needed. So I mentioned that there were some medical questions for passengers. So do any of the passengers have chronic conditions, particularly breathing or heart problems that may be aggravated by flight conditions? So if you got to fly at 10,000 feet to get somewhere and you've got somebody who is hypoxic, you could kill them. So that's a good question to ask. Do any of the passengers have acute or chronic respiratory illness? Another thing that's likely to flare up the higher your altitude gets or the drier the air gets. Third, do any of the passengers have a health history of conditions that may suddenly incapacitate them, such as epilepsy? Well, you sure don't want somebody in the front seat of a plane near the controls if they're going to get an epileptic seizure. Fourth, what medications are passengers taking? And do they have necessary medications with them? So you don't want a person going unstable while they're in the plane on a long flight. And do any passengers have seriously impaired mobility? If they do, maybe you want to get one of our cargo door aircraft and load them through the cargo doors rather than asking them to get up on a wing and maybe fall off the wing and hit their head on the pavement. In terms of medical cargo questions, you can ask, does the cargo manifest include medical supplies? So if it does, and if they're being transported, are there any special requirements for temperature, vibration, or delivery time? You know, if you have a bio-sensitive product, an organ for transplant, you have a limited time to get there. If you have vaccines that need to be stored at minus 140 degrees Fahrenheit, you better have your storage good for the time of the trip in the plane. Next up, is the cargo toxic to humans? And if so, is it adequately sealed and protected against container damage? Number 4, does the cargo represent a biohazard? So for instance, that could be diagnostic blood samples or human tissues. They better be well protected and sealed if they are. Now, I mentioned a minute ago about deviations to the DART. So you as the DART incident commander, at any time, be it an annual exercise or an actual mobilization, you have full authority to deviate from the DART to the extent needed to address the accident. So what are some of the common reasons that we deviate? Well, for one reason, it might be that the particular procedure in the DART really isn't applicable to this operation. And I come back to the example of not needing a customer service department when there's only one customer. Next up, there might be a better way to do it. So we found in our DART this weekend that our passenger, our service request log needed a couple more columns. So we added a couple more columns to capture emails and phone numbers so we could find these passengers more quickly. And Next up, the staff might be unable to implement a procedure as written because maybe you just don't have the forms available, or maybe you don't have the time because there's such a volume of stuff going through, you don't have staff that can handle it. Or you just don't have time to train them the way they need to be trained to do this thing right. If that's the case, then you can change or eliminate that procedure. And the requirement there is you can only do it if safety is not impaired, because we certainly don't want to compromise safety in an operation. And rather than giving up on the procedure, you might consider asking for additional assistance. Maybe we can fly in some forms to help you or fly in some trained people. And the last point at the bottom, we tend to be lenient for mobilizations because that's where the rubber is hitting the road, and we really need to focus on what can we do to best serve the problem, the people that are impacted by this disaster. Opposed to that, and in contrast to that, is the annual exercise. In the annual exercise, the emphasis on training and learning how to do things right. So we really don't want to give up on procedures unnecessarily for an annual exercise. Now, let me just take a quick look. We've got a fair amount of stuff to go through before we're done. So I'm going to stop the share. I'm going to see if anybody's awake. We've got about another 30 minutes, I think, to get through this. Would you rather do that right now? Or would you rather schedule a new session when your brain is fresh? So all those who would rather finish right now, please raise your hand. Okay. And all those people who would rather have a session on another week and finish this off, raise your hand. Looks like the people who want to do it tonight are slightly in the majority. So, but some people want to talk. So Colette, go ahead and say something.
Well, I had raised I thought you wanted hands raised for voting.
Okay, I see what
Put
you're
it down.
saying. And Mary, you were in the same way?
Right.
Yeah, okay, good enough. Okay, so we will, does anybody need a bio break or are you all good to go? Okay, we'll go. Here goes. Back to the share. Okay, so that's operating the DART for the DART, mostly. We've done medical packs questions, medical cargo questions, authorizing deviations to the DART. And now we get to shutting down operations. So your exercise is over or your mobilization is over. What do? We'll have a hot wash, which is fireman talk for a debriefing after the exercise. Discuss what went well, what didn't, and ideas for improvement, because everything always has something that could do better. And the emphasis on these exercises and every time we get together and do something is trying to learn and improve. So have someone taking notes, and that'll be an after action report when the thing is all done. Next up, doesn't really say it on here, but be sure you put everything away. Normally you get a fair amount of equipment out for an exercise or a mobilization. You want to put everything away so that it's well stored, easily retrievable in a hurry the next time you need it. Next up, write a consolidate event documentation and store it for 3 years. So preferably a big binder with tabs for all the different areas or some means that you use to store your incident documentation. And the last one there is writing and distributing that plan of improvement. So I use the term after action report, which is also commonly used in the industry. In CalDART, it's referred to as a plan of improvement. Now, large operations. What are some things about large operations that we haven't already talked about? We did a good job on that first flight talking about all the different things these various sections are doing. So I didn't mention much about photographer and videographer. It is good to have your event documented. It's a wonderful morale booster when you put out a story that tells people what you did. It's also a good record for the future of how things were set up in case there's any questions. So it's good if you can get this done. And even informally, you know, everybody has a smartphone, have them take pictures and send them into you when the whole thing is over. Diane, go ahead.
Paul, when we set up a DART, is it 24 hours, 24/7? Or is it 8 hours a day? Don't think we've ever mentioned that.
Yeah, that's completely the choice of the DART incident commander. It's easiest to operate daylight VFR and safest, but you may have a need to operate at night. You may have an airport that's well suited to run at night, in which case you can run 24/7. Forest fire people used to only run during the daytime for their air operations, but now they're getting night vision goggles and they're beginning to operate at night. So that's the choice of the people on the scene.
Okay, if we do a 24/7 operation, I'm assuming that we'd have multiple teams because you can't go that long you got to go home and sleep or whatever. Or when we have a big DART like that, are there facilities there to sleep or bathrooms or food or anything like that? How is
That
that?
would go into your logistics and facilities manager, the facilities manager putting things together. And really, I'd like Roy Shackle to speak. Roy's retired emergency services coordinator with the city of Gilroy and has way more experience in this particular topic than I do. Go ahead, Roy.
Okay, the biggest thing is the operational period. When you start filling out that incident action plan, you're going to set, whoever is the incident commander is going to set the operational period. Now it will depend on the level of activation and the level of need, but it could be a 24-hour operational period. Now, that doesn't mean that you're there for the whole 24 hours. You could be activated but not operational for the night from 2000 till 0800 the next day. There are no operations. But for every operational period, however long that operational period is, there's a incident action plan. It gets renewed with each operational period. So it could be 24 hours of which you are not doing stuff all 24 hours. On the other hand, if it's an airport that has facilities that you could sleep and shower and all that good stuff, yes, you may be there, but you're not going to be functioning very well after about 10 or 12 hours. And since safety is the number one thing, especially on the flight lines, you don't want tired people working around turning props and other dangerous things. So the operational period is set by the incident commander, however long he or she wants to make it. And you could be active or activated, but not operational for part of that time. Does that, I hope that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, it did. Pilots have a self-test called I Am Safe, where we have a number of different factors that we look at before we allow ourselves to fly. It's an FAA recommendation. It's not a requirement, but if something happens and we haven't done that, your insurance companies are not going to be there for us at all.
That's right. And if the pilots aren't IFR, they can't operate outside of VFR time. So that kind of limits your resources. Now, again, a lot is going to depend on the needs of the incident, but the incident commander is the one who is going to have the say on how things will run.
Thank you, Roy. Ed Story, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and you'll quickly recognize why I'm bringing this up, that the getting the press involved, I just want to underscore that, because if your airport is under any kind of pressure in terms of local folk that want to do away with the airport, saving the airport can be a real function of CalDART. Any exercise that takes place, or of course, actual disaster operations, but the aspect of providing information to the local public as to the value of the airport can be a very real service that's provided by CalDART.
Thank you,
We've
Ed.
tried. We certainly have tried.
Okay, so other things on here. Facilities manager, if you want to get cots to sleep on, if you want to get a generator to drive electricity so you can operate your equipment, if you can maybe tap into AC if it's running at the airport, all those are things that a facilities manager can do. Medical service, if you have a really bad disaster, wouldn't it be great if you could liaise with your county health officer and they could get some medical people down at the airport to do a medical triage on people and give advice on who we should be carrying and who we shouldn't. We may have a need for a nurse or something just for people on the ramp that have conditions that show up. And a nurse may be available from the general population fairly easily. For food service, even for something as simple as an annual exercise, if you get 30 people involved, it sure is nice if there's some food to chow down on at lunchtime and you don't have to bring your own box lunch. But for a bigger group, if you've got people at the airport and they can't go to the store and buy food, well, now you've got to worry about, how do I feed 3 meals a day to my volunteers? Security. As you get a bigger operation, and if you start to get broader sets of people on the ramp and broader sets of people acting as your volunteers, we're not really doing as rigorous an employee intake as would be done in the governmental or private sectors with a background check. So there is a chance that someday we will have, thieves that are among us on the ramp, either in the people that walk into the operational area or in some of the volunteers that are there. And to the extent we have high value medicines, narcotics, and other things that would be easily taken, security could be a very nice function to fill for your ramp and your material storage area to make sure that nothing walks away. Recruitment manager. So often we don't staff the recruitment manager, but if you get a recruitment manager and staff, that helps you make all those phone calls that need to be made to really staff up an organization and get it to be big. They can also do a lot of the pilot intake work and the passenger volunteer intake work that would otherwise burden your flight ops group and your customer, burden your flight ops group and your general work. For a moment, I said passenger. Your recruitment manager is not going to deal with passengers. That's solely the province of customer service. All those passenger waivers are going to be signed through customer service. Colette, go ahead.
Yeah, Paul, one of the things with, when you were talking security, high value cargo, blood, medicine, stuff like that, they usually come with their own care because, so many of those are time sensitive and would all be part of us receiving that kind of material. And I'm guessing it wouldn't sit long because the clock's running.
Sure. And that's a mark of a good operation. If your customer service have identified a customer that has a need for a quick turn, they show up, they get into a plane, hopefully you're taking care of that and working with flight ops so it happens the moment that cargo gets to the airport. Okay, next step. Applying unified command to CalDART. So now unified command, when you get big regional disasters, you have a whole lot of different agencies that all own a piece of the response. And unified command is a way that they've come up with to distribute different responsibilities to different areas, but more importantly, to get them all coordinated so that regionally there are goals and objectives that are set that make sense for the entire region, and that all your different pieces of the machinery are all operating in harmony with each other. So in a classic, and by the way, Roy, to the extent I misspeak, you probably know this a lot better than I. Go ahead and put your hand up if something else needs to be said. So when they do this the big time way, they will run a separate emergency operations center that has representatives of all these different organizations in it. And they have a PIO, a public information officer, that coordinates the messaging between all these disparate groups to go out and give unified messages to the public. So when I say that we lean on the county to help us get our messaging into the system, this is the kind of a sieve we're having to go through to get our message out there and be heard. Now, how do we apply unified command to CalDART? So, taking it down to our scale, we don't have nearly the thousands of people involved that public agencies do. We don't have nearly the complexity and so many different kinds of agencies all operating together. To me, the way it relates to us is that we have at the moment 13 DARTs around the state. And all of our DARTs are a little bit challenged to operate at large scale. It gets pretty complicated pretty fast. So it may be that we could divide a big problem into little groups. And maybe one DART is in charge of handling the state's needs. Maybe the state's asking for something. Another DART might be in charge of handling 1 or 2 counties in the disaster area that have big time needs. And by working with a smaller set of customers, we can have a smaller set of pilots serving those customers, and we can start carving it down into a level of scale that we can individually manage. And of course, another way to do it is to have each airport, which is basically our current organizational structure, be in charge of everything that goes through that airport. So that may also be a sensible way to apply unified command to CalDART. So I'm going to take a look at all these bullets. And of course, CalDART would provide some assistance in getting all the different DARTs coordinated and getting resources applied to the disaster, and maybe dealing with some of the statewide agencies that the individual DARTs don't have contacts with. And so I guess, so that's it for the applying unified command to CalDART. Roy, go ahead.
I was just going to say that's kind of merging area command with unified command. Area command is for a large scale incident that covers possibly many counties, and it's controlled by, in this case, DARTs all over the place would be under one command who would be giving them instructions on what to do. They would have to do all the operation stuff, but it would be coordinated at a higher level, and that's area command, or that also could be considered area command.
Thank you, Roy. Diane.
Sorry to ask so many questions, but we live in an area here of about 2 million people and has 8 airports, but only 1 DART. Is that really enough to handle this area?
So what area are you speaking of, Diane?
Santa Clara Valley.
Okay, so Santa Clara,
the San Francisco Bay Area.
Santa Clara County is the richest county in the state for DARTs. It has 3 separate DART organizations, 3 out of the 13. So each of the general aviation airports, Palo Alto, Reed Hillview, and San Martin, has a separate DART. That said, 13 DARTs in a state of 40 million people, that's not a lot of DARTs. So we could very easily get totally overwhelmed. And we need to optimize our contribution in a disaster, pick the highest value applications that best fit our capabilities. Okay. And Roy, thank you very much for the clarification on area command and unified command. Definitely wanted to cover the area command concept as well, and I just totally missed it in my very brief review. Thank you. Okay, so we've talked about that. Now working at DART incident commanders and shifts. We've kind of covered this topic already. Kwang Wei, go ahead.
Oh, I just had a question. In my earlier email to you, we talked about SCAPA. What does SCAPA mean?
What does
The
SCAPA
SCAPA
mean?
DART? Yeah.
SCAPA is the
SCAPA.
South County Airport Pilots Association.
Oh,
It is a chapter of the California Pilots Association. And it's based at San Martin Airport, which used to be called South County Airport. And SCAPA has just never updated its legal name.
got it. Thank you for that.
Okay, you're welcome. And so we've talked about working DART incident commanders and shifts. And I don't think there's anything to add to what we've already said in that area.
Excuse me, I would think that the people at all levels would, at the time of the shift change, the operational period, would talk to their equivalent on the next shift to brief them as to what's happening in their area.
Yeah, Roy, can you speak to the change of shift things that generally happen in a real live operation? You know, obviously there's a fresh report that the incident commander puts together, but is Wayne's point valid for all the different levels as well?
Yes, it should be, or it's supposed to be. At the end of the operational period, the oncoming shift gets the incident action plan that has been prepared by the planning section, and they know then what has been done and what they're supposed to be doing for the next operational period. Now, like I say, you could have breaks in the operational period. You could have a 24-hour operational period that has no action going on. And so pretty much nothing has changed when you get back to work. But when you change shifts, in other words, when you're replaced, you should be handing them the new incident action plan for the next operational period.
Thank you, Roy. And let me go back up to the org chart that we had here. The planning section chief, documentation manager. So as you start operating at these bigger scales, you're pushing out a lot more paper. And at our little bitty exercises, typically it's the DART incident commander that's generating a lot of the paper, and maybe he's getting some help from customer service and flight ops. When you're making incident plans and you're filing all these different forms for a full action plan, an incident plan, that's a lot of documentation to generate. So you get people in a planning section who are really good at producing documentation and doing planning for the operation. They're supposed to put that together. Okay, coming back here.
I have one more question, Paul.
Diane.
Why instead of using paper forms, aren't we putting all this on a computer?
Well, we have partly paper and partly computer. Finish your question. Go ahead.
It seems like it'd be much easier to transmit this information somewhere if we needed to, and also to store it rather than have it all on paper.
Yeah, so the problem with computers is computers may not be available at the time of a real exercise. If there is a nuclear flash, I forget the exact word for it, but basically all your computers might die. So everybody should have paper stocked at their airport ready to go. Now that said, I'm working mostly with computers these days. You can do shared work items. If you have a customer service team, they can all work from home and they can all share common documents through something like Google Documents, which allows everybody to work from the same single document, even though they're in different places. So we're using hybrid electronic and paper at this point. Colette, go ahead. You're muted, Colette.
I had in one of my trainings that emergency managers were so used to computerized maps, and the computerized maps went down, and first responders did not know how to read paper maps anymore. And there is a need for the old-fashioned paper, just what you said. What do you do if the computers go down, if the communications go down? You know, don't get so reliant on computers that you don't know how to use the old-fashioned tools too, because the old-fashioned tools work pretty good. So I'm with you on computerize as much as possible, but yes, still do leave paper trails.
Thank you, Colette. Hey, I'm just going to say one more time, everybody, please put a chat in the chat box with your name and email address on it if you haven't already done that. We did have a few people who joined late, so we'd like to keep a record of who attended the meeting. Okay, so back to here. Other forms of interest. So aircraft marshaling signals. These are forms that you might want to use, but I haven't really covered tonight. Not going to cover them too much, but I just want to mention them so that you're aware of them. Airport information sheet. So that's a form that's out there if special things are going on with any particular airports, especially as relates to the disaster, and people aren't likely to get that on their briefings, or if it's not possible to get a standard briefing, we've got an airport information sheet where you can write down the information that a pilot needs to know to go fly there. And certainly with all of our DART airports, we expect that they'll be reporting to each other conditions at their own airport if you cannot get those conditions publicly. Diane, go ahead.
Sorry. All pilots have access to AirNav, which provides a complete set of information for every airport. Some of us carry the airport information manual in their flight bags, which is a printed version that has a page for every airport in the country. So
Yep.
DART shouldn't have to provide that. If
Yeah,
you're a
so
pilot, you should have that already.
Diane, the point here is if there's non-publicly available information in a disaster, you know, AirNav may not be functioning. The normal means of submitting NOTAMs may not be working. So if you've got information that pilots aren't going to be able to get through a normal briefing, that's when you use the airport information sheet. So next up, DART binders, covers, spines, and tabs. Some of you, as you go along, will get a little bit more professional about the documentation you're keeping ready to go when a disaster hits. And if you build up go binders for each of the departments, customer service, flight operations, volunteer recruitment, there exist materials to help you create your own binders. Safety vest labels. We have an official CalDART vest. It's got a standard ICS label on the front for putting your name and a big label on the back for putting your title. So you can create those. And we have a form that's already got all those labels created, so you just print it off. I have emergency manager summary sheet. Part of your public outreach in your local jurisdiction is to give all of your agencies, whether they be the city or the county or the volunteer organizations active in disaster or other community organizations active in disaster, give them all a one-page summary about your DART so they know how to contact it, they know how to request service, they know in a nutshell what you do. Next up is event signage. If you get a big thing going at the airport, you want to have signs that point the way. So there's some pre-made event signage that you can just take to a printer and print out. For ICS Form 205 Incident Radio Communications Plan, hopefully you'll be using those at all your annual presentations when you're working your radio group. Now we get into the concept of what's a minimum annual acceptable exercise. So the event registration form requirements, you've got to have a responsible person. You've got to register it with the CalDART through the events at caldart.org, and it's got to be accepted. You've got to file a Form California 220A a week before with CalDART so we can proofread it for you, and the day before with the California Air Coordination Group. You've got to have at least one flight. Your pilots and event managers must be CalDART members. Pilots must present a medical basis for flight, whether that's basic med or a class 1, 2, 3 certificate. They've got to have a private pilot or better certificate. They've got to have a government issued photo ID that you've checked, and aircraft liability insurance, minimum $1 million and 100,000. They've got to use an approved DART, disaster airlift response plan. That doesn't imply that they're completely conformant to that DART, but they've got to use it as their reference for the exercise. Version 2.1 DART or approved alternate. Everyone involved signs a waiver. Keep your records for 3 years and produce them upon request. And here's a new one. Our insurer has been asking us, what did you do in the last year? So now we're starting to collect, well, how many number of flights did you run? And what was the total Hobbs time for aircraft in your event? And include the positioning flights as well as the actual operational flights. So it may be that some pilot's flying from another airport to come help you and get that flying time to and from his home airport as well. Kwong-Wei, go ahead.
Which form do we use to report the number of flights and total Hobbs?
We don't have a form for that yet. So hopefully we'll get it. But in the meantime, just please report it to events@caldart.org.
Sounds good.
Okay. So minimum acceptable first or exercise. Some of you will be planning to start your own DART and, what do I have to do? So what you do is everything on the previous slide, plus in addition to that, we want to see some of your exercise documentation. So we're going to want to see a personnel duty roster, a service request log. And if you don't use that, you could also have used the shipping receiving log, which is a little bit simpler to fill out. We're going to want to see your pilot and aircraft information forms and your pilot list that you created out of that, and your aircraft load sheets and the airlift dispatch log that you dispatched your pilots with. So put all that in a copy machine and send it in, scan it, send it in, and that would be the documentation that we would want to see. And that's approved. Now you've finished your initial operating experience and you're a CalDART approved DART. So a little bit more about leading an annual exercise. So our minimum exercise is easiest for the first timers. Some people get really ambitious. Santa Monica and Reed Hillview come to mind. Now, of course, they're both under threat of closure. So they got really ambitious for their first exercises and went way over the top and having beautiful exercises, very impressive, but it was difficult for them and they didn't have to do that. So you can do a minimum exercise for starters, 1 aircraft and 1 DART incident commander. So you, in general, want to arrange your volunteers, cargo, passengers, and flights all ahead of the date because you have the time to do it and it just reduces stress on the day of and it reduces the number of hours you've got to sit at the airport and have everybody sit around while you're trying to fill out paperwork. So that includes doing your pilot intake before the exercise because pilots are always forgetting something. If you wait till the day of, not only does it take a long time to look at all their documentation, but they always forget something or something's wrong and now they can't fly. So of course, we're wanting to save time and stress on the day of exercise by getting this done ahead of time. This also helps you balance supply and demand. So the supply is your pilots who are going to fly, and your demand is the people that you're going to give rides to or the cargo that you're going to fly. And of course, you don't want a pilot showing up and then he doesn't get someone to fly. And by the same token, you don't want to make that pilot work from 7 in the morning till 6 at night to get everybody flown that showed up that day. So if you arrange it ahead of time, you can keep it at a happy level for everybody involved. And finally, it's harder to get volunteers for an exercise compared with a real disaster. So, and we see this with CalDART. When COVID hits, when the fires hit, people jump out of the woodwork to come help you. But if you're doing something boring like an annual exercise, that tends to be a lot harder. So to the extent you can do scenario building with your annual exercise, tell a good story that gets people excited and helps them see the vision of why being in a DART is a good thing, that gets them motivated to participate with you and respond. And now we've been asking questions all night long. Peg Gardner has a wonderful sense of humor. I like emergency management in Ireland. So crowds panic as the flooding threatens Ireland, but calm heads prevail. So that's a good approach. Not that we want to have alcohol and fly, of course, but I like the thought that people maintain their calm and happy state when they're in the middle of a disaster. Anybody have any questions? I'll go ahead and kill the share. I want to congratulate you all for making it to the end. And Dave, go ahead.
I'm just curious if you had an event, a DART where you needed pilots, but you had planes, like if there was an FBO that had a flight school with a bunch of planes, but the disaster radio comes on TV and says, everybody go to work kind of thing. Does that work? Would an FBO have you ever heard of that? Allowing their rental fleet to go to pilots showing up for a DART event because they can't get to their plane or they're from not out of the area.
Well, we want everybody to be safe. And if you're flying in a plane that you don't have any time in, you might do something unsafe. So hopefully that pilot that's using the FBO's plane is getting a chance to get a checkout before he's authorized to go take that plane and go fly somewhere. And the amount of checkout he needs might be a function of how many hours he has. Might be a function of how many hours he has and how similar aircraft he's flown to the one that he would be using as a rental.
I have a question, Paul. I still have lots of them. When a disaster happens, what triggers DART? Does the county call us? Or we decide on our own to jump into it? How does that work?
Okay, so the core team and the DART, they get together and they talk among themselves. How bad is this? Do we think we're going to need to be activated? Are we at least concerned enough that we want to start talking and asking people in the community? So if we're going to do that, who are we going to put in charge of it? So that's step one. Now somebody's in charge of it. Now they go to those people that they've built ties with over the years. In emergency management, your contact list is everything. You want to know all the people involved in disaster response in your community and reach out to them privately. Like, what do you think? How bad does this look? Should we consider activating? Do you have anything you need right now? So those are the kind of things. And if service is needed right now, you do it.
Okay, if there's a disaster, should we call you to find out, or we wait for you to call us? What do we do?
So that I'll go ahead and answer your question, and I'm going to go to Ed's story next. So if there's a disaster, the local DART is the one in charge of responding to that disaster. If they want help, they go out to the DART network. If they want a kibitz with me or anybody else, we're available. What do you think? And then if there's a disaster in a place where there isn't a DART, CalDART may reach out through its various networks, NorCal-VOAD, SoCal-VOAD, California Emergency Services Association, and see if people there think they need some help, and we might put something together. We also might get a request that comes in requesting our help, in which case we will try to fill that request. Ed Story, go ahead.
Another 2 points, another outreach point. You've heard me speak about it earlier this evening, is the American Red Cross. If they're doing something and you're connected to them in any fashion or form, that can be a trigger point. Break from that, back to the exercises. It seems to me that if we put together, and this is just a suggestion, if we put together a list amongst all the people that are on this call and some of the other calls that you've had, Paul, that says something to the effect that, does your DART want to do an exercise in some time frame, 2-month time frame, 3 months, 1 month, whatever. And if you do, what are those months? And then the objective would be to get at least 2 darts working with each other, possibly 3, but at least 2, so that people would have someplace to go. The folks in the other one would have someplace to go. And there would be sort of an initiation of cooperation. And it would also provide a substantially greater sense of urgency in actually having the exercise, because we could say, hey, we've got another airport that's going to be working with us, 2 parts of the barbell, if you will, and they're scheduled for this. We want to schedule for the same time, so there we go.
Well, that's a good point. And, you know, both kinds of exercises are good. On the one hand, you want to exercise the dart by itself and have them be focused outward into their community so that they learn and develop relationships with all the emergency people in their community. They invite them to come into their dart, and they invent some nifty flight scenarios that they can use to transport people around or help with the local food bank, food drive, or whatever. So that's one way to do it. The other way to do it is just as you say, let's build connections within our darts. And that helps us, you know, work this concept of area command and unified command, where darts are working together, and like we might have to do on a really big operation. We do have a monthly call with all the dart leaders around the state, and we have a roundtable, and that's a wonderful place to bring up that kind of suggestion. I will also note that one bad part of doing operations like that, where it's multiple, you might find that instead of getting 5 dart incident commanders to all get practice in organizing an exercise, that 1 dart incident commander gets a lot of practice in organizing 5 different darts. And so that's not really helpful, because you do want to build expertise at the individual dart level. So Mary, go ahead.
Yeah, one thing that, and I think Ed asked, or actually made the comment earlier about Santa Monica, but one omission that I see both in the presentation, but also in some of the material, is reaching out to air traffic control. So especially airports where there's a control tower facility, but also, even if there's not, there's either a TRACON or there's an en route center that, you know, has operational control of a flight that's IFR especially. And it just seems to me that it would be a really good idea to have somebody on the dart that's either liaisoning with air traffic control or informing them, or especially if it's a controlled airport where, you know, there's going to be certain area that's cordoned off, there's going to be activity, that it seems like it would be a really good idea to have somebody on the dart that is actually has that as a job, either a job title or as part of their responsibilities. And I would also just say that the National Air Traffic Controllers Association, NATCA, has a really strong safety organization. And I think that they would actually be very keen to participate and help support any local DART if they're aware.
I think that's a great idea. The ATC can shut the airport down to other traffic if we need to get in and out quickly. Otherwise, we're going to have to sit there and wait our turn to take off.
So Mary, I think you've identified really some unworked ground within CalDART that's very worthy of work. I know I already tasked you with something last night, but would you be interested in taking this one on as well? I think you have a sense for maybe how we could improve in this area. You might be able to make a good contribution.
Yeah, I would be very happy to do that, because again, I think they're a big partner and they can really help support and facilitate, you know, what we're trying to do. And I know that, I think, you know, again, the air traffic controllers that I've worked with in the past, you know, would be very keen to do that. And I'm happy to take.
Okay, good. Bob Goodwin.
Oh, yes.
By the
before
way,
we-
let me give everyone a quick introduction. Bob is our Vice President of Methods, Procedures, and Certification. So when you have a annual exercise, Bob's your man. Bob, go ahead.
Yes, when I was flight ops manager doing our drill at BW, I took it as my job to inform the tower of what we were going to be doing and making sure they were aware. So the function of dealing with ATC would probably fall under flight ops.
Thank you, Bob. Gary, go ahead.
We may have covered it, and forgive me for re-asking, but do we get a unique call sign as part of this, like Cal Fire or Cal Star, or the ones that we're all familiar with?
Mary's going to address that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gary. Perfect question. Yes, we do. So CalDART is a registered member of the Air Care Alliance, and the Air Care Alliance is an association, an alliance, of course, of public benefit flying organizations. And they have arranged with the FAA that we pilots can get our own call number. So basically, you register with the Air Care Alliance, and I believe Bob Goodwin is the one to help you do this. But you fill out a form and you get your own compassion number. So you might be Charlie Mike Foxtrot 1234. And now that's a number you can use anytime you're on a CalDART mission. And we don't have a CalDART specific call sign, but we can use one registered through the Air Care Alliance. Okay, so Wayne, you have a comment. Go ahead.
Now, I'd like to make an observation concerning Diane's question of a little while ago about activation of DART. One of the characteristics of our conversation today in this meeting has been that we're treating all disasters equally without distinguishing between a big fire, a flood, massive earthquake, plane crash, and other weird things that we never even thought about. And the byword for every disaster is flexibility, as I think should be, I hope is obvious. So that we are trying to plan for everything, but we know perfectly well a lot of weird things are going to happen that we never thought about. And so some disasters, for example, are self-activating, like a massive earthquake. You don't need to call up anybody and say, hey, could you help out? We all know, no, we're in DART and we know that it's obvious that this is really big. But there could be a smaller disasters where you don't even realize it's happening 20 miles away. There could be a plane crash, for example, or a massive neighborhood fire, or maybe even a local flood. There may be 200 people dead, and you didn't even notice it. And so somebody has to call you up to say, hey, by the way, did you know about the disaster? And so my point is, there's a wide variety of ways to be activated. And in some cases, it's self-activating and it's just obvious. In other cases, some Ray Shackle in his previous job would be a city emergency manager, might call up. He happens to know about DART and he knows Paul Marshall or whoever's in San Jose and would request DART from that standpoint. Maybe Paul didn't even know there's a disaster going on. And so he would contact the rest of the group. So it all boils down to what Paul said, that the leaders of the local DART need to decide to get activated, but they could get activated either because it's obvious or because somebody on the outside requested them to be activated.
Hey, Paul, if I could just interject here that either you or Wayne or Roy might want to comment on one thing that I don't think has been covered, and it comes to mind with the compassion call sign and so forth, and that is, how do we deal with TFRs?
Yeah, we talked about TFRs, I believe, in the flight operations segment. But basically, a TFR will have a responsible person associated with it. We'll call that responsible person and say, hey, we need to use your airspace. Let's talk. This is what we need. Can you give it to us and see if there's a way that both people can use the airspace safely. Coming back to Wayne's comment about activation, there's one other mechanism of activation that's happened several times, and I don't think I had a slide for it. And that is where somebody comes to CalDART because they're aware of CalDART as a statewide organization, and they say, we're having this problem and we want you to help us with it. So that happened with the Dixie Fire. It happened with the Oregon fires. It happened with the UROC airlift. And in those cases, the way we handled that was we put out a notice to the core group of people in CalDART, all the DART leaders, and said, you know, this request has just come in. Is any DART in position to manage this? And when we do that, it's basically we're talking the leader of that DART, or like 2 or 3 people that are capable of being DART incident commanders. Can they pick it up? And at that point, they have the resources of the whole state CalDART to call upon. So we have a contact list where if we need pilots, we go to all 300 people and say, you know, we need pilots for this operation. Mary McMillan's managing it. Contact her at such and such if you're able to support. And this is what they need. They need ground personnel, they need pilots, and it's going to happen on this date, that sort of thing. So that's another activation method that we've used in the past. Okay, any other questions or comments? Well, you all get the star for endurance. This is a full 2-hour session. Good job.
Paul?
Yeah, I have one. When I'm in the air and if I'm over, let's say 4,000 feet, I don't have any access to phone communication. The only thing I would have is NorCal or ATC. And if I need to communicate with DART, how would I do that?
You can't. So unless you have a sat phone in your plane, or unless you can text a message when you're in a rural area where you have better coverage than over a metro area, you're out of luck. Okay, let's go back to raising hands. Colette, you're next.
Paul, we were talking a little bit air traffic control and TFRs. The TFRs are issued by the ACG, so nobody's going to be in any kind of airspace doing any flying without a TFR, and that's going to come from the AC, the ACG. So at there, Mary, when you're talking about one of the levels of communication with ATC is when airspace is notamed out, when you first are coming in and out of the center, or, you know, you're changing boundaries of any air traffic control, you're going to have to give your TFR number to be able to go through the restricted airspace.
Yeah, so one fine point on that, the FAA publishes the TFR and they own it. But you're right, the California Air Coordination Group has their ear. And so they may be feeding them things that end up influencing that TFR. Most of the TFRs that get written are fire TFRs, and in particular, CAL FIRE is going to be driving it. But you also have airshow TFRs, and it's the person who's managing the airshow. So when you have a unique disaster, that's where it's more likely to be the California Air Coordination Group might be the person you call on that particular TFR to get authorization to use it. Gary, go ahead.
A couple comments on the communications. Ham radio works really well in the air, and I'd like to see CalDART continue to leverage the ham guys. Our initial exercise, we had one just volunteer to ride along on our flight, and it worked out really, really well. On the TFRs, the situation that we're responding to might also generate a TFR. And if we're part of that and have a call sign and real tight with ATC, the skids are greased for us to fly in and out of that is my expectation.
One thought,
anyway.
Gary, on the airborne ham radios. Ham radio operators get a license to operate from the surface. They don't get a license to operate from the air. And you're right, they work a lot better in the air and they cover a whole lot more ground.
Yeah.
And there can be radio interference problems associated with that. I'm not an expert on it, but I know the guy that coordinates our statewide response had a conniption fit when we tried to do a joint exercise with the Civil Air Patrol and put ham radio frequencies up in the air, like, so maybe we would join all of our CalDART operators in the Bay Area by having a floating aircraft overhead. He just said that was a bad idea. Wayne, can you speak to that at all, or?
Well, I've never heard of any restrictions about ham radio in the air other than practicality. I'm not aware of any regulations. And the practical standpoint is that you're covering a much wider geographic area when you're transmitting. So you have to be aware. That's why you have a license instead of allowing the public to use ham radios. You have to be aware of the fact that you're covering a wider area. I remember, by the way, one time I was in Monterey, and I decided to try to call my ham radio frequency repeater in Morgan Hill, which is maybe 20 miles away, but it's over a mountain. And I was just curious, so I listened in, I could hear people talking. And to cut a long story short, there was a repeater in Eureka that's about 200 miles away on the same frequency, and they were mystified as to who this weird guy is. I had no idea where that city was. I never even heard of the town where they were talking, like I was from New York or something. But the point is that even though I was at sea level, the ocean water carries radio signals better, just like being in the airplane carries your signal over a longer distance. You have to be aware of that kind of stuff, possibly interfering with other people and talking to people that you didn't know existed.
Okay, thank you, Wayne. Diane?
Get my hand down first. This is a question, I think, from Mary, but it might have been Colette. If they're generated TFR, how can we get the TFR number to call ATC and get clearance to go through it? Who do we communicate to?
That, oh, if I'm correct, it's the incident commander is going to be talking with the ACG to get the TFRs. And maybe that's in between communication. You were talking tonight about the area commander and all of that.
That would probably be NorCal though, and not the local ATC, wouldn't it?
You
Certainly
know,
would depend. And again, I think that's the importance of actually having a conduit to ATC, both local and NorCal and possibly, you know, the center.
No, a local ATC can always call. They have all kinds of numbers. So we
Well,
we call our local ATC before we take off, or do we, like we do when we do flight following, or do we go through the incident commander, Paul, to get that information?
My understanding, I've had a couple conversations about how to resolve TFRs. Like we did this a couple of years ago at the CalDART annual meeting with the guy that runs CAL FIRE. And I've seen this happen with air shows as well. When the FAA publishes a TFR, they're publishing it at the request of somebody that wanted a restriction on the airspace. And the organization that makes that request is going to have a responsible person with a phone number that the general public can call and ask for permission to use the airspace. So you get a briefing, you look at the TFR, you see who the person and the phone number is on that TFR, and you call them up and you say, we need to use it. And that could be the flight operations group at a particular DART. It could be the DART incident commander.
So we'll get the information internally rather than call ourselves to ATC.
Well, anybody who's a pilot for a DART is working through that DART, and it's the flight operations group to work through issues like that.
Okay.
And that would be,
I want
if
to
we
know
had special,
now.
if we
rather
had
than-
special briefing information that we would give to our pilots, that would be one of the examples of special briefing information. We have arranged a special clearance to operate within this TFR, and here are our operating limitations when we use that clearance.
Okay. Because if we're in a disaster area, we may be in a TFR.
We might.
We can't take off until we get clearance.
We had our Angwin people, the DART, actually get a clearance to go through a CAL FIRE TFR a couple of years ago when they were fighting fires in the Angwin area. And that was exactly what happened. They called the CAL FIRE person responsible for that TFR and said, hey, we have an operation. We need to launch a plane at this time. Can we do it? And they said, sure, go ahead. And so that was how they successfully negotiated the particular terms of that TFR, even though normal pilots would not be allowed into it, they were. Okay.
Is it similar
any
to
more-
getting a, I got a question, Paul. Is it similar to getting an airspace waiver from TSA to go through a TFR? Is that, I'm looking at, like, for example, I'm just looking at Oakland's TFR for the A's game right now. And it says you can get authorization, can be found at tsa.gov for airspace waivers or by calling the TSA. And it gives their phone number. And at the end, it gives another person's number to call about the TFR. So it's kind of interesting. I'm looking deeper into it.
Yeah, I never dealt with the TSA TFR. Any other questions? Any other comments people want to make? Okay, well, the Endurance Award goes to this group. Thank you for making it to the end. Thank you for making this inaugural training series happen.
Great.
Very helpful. I'm learning a ton of stuff. Thank you, Paul.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Now we can all be incident commanders.
This was really good. Thank you.
Good collaboration. Thanks for the effort.
Thanks.
You're welcome.